Anyway, thanks for joining me. Thanks for me joining you. We want this hour to be valuable to the audience. We're going to talk about food addiction, everything you always wanted to know. So, first of all, congratulations on your textbook. Okay, the textbook is called Processed Food Addiction, and everyone out there, you can find Joan's work at processedfoodaddiction.com. Joan has a very, very interesting story. Businesswoman from Stanford, basically gave it all up because she sort of, she had the moment, she had the eureka, she had the nirvana, and she dumped her previous job and went and got a PhD in neuroscience to learn about food addiction, and is now, spreading the gospel, all over the world. And now with the internet and with COVID, we need this even more.
Well, Rob, I'm remembering the first time I met you, the textbook came out at the same time as your previous book, Hacking of the American Mind. And I remember just thinking those two books were continuations of each other. And what I really like about your work is that you get above the neck. So many writers are stuck, in digestion. This is a neurological problem on top of everything else. And what I really like about your story is now you have Metabolical out. I am telling everybody, I'm just going to be very upfront here. I think that's the most important book of the century. And I have to say, I had to take a deep breath because I used to think the textbook, describing processed food addiction might be, a really important book. But what you've done in Metabolical is you have told the truth from the whole range of where the problem occurs. It's the corporations all the way down to cell function. And I think one of the most arresting stories out of the Metabolical book was how you went into medical school with a nutrition background, and they not only talked you out of it, they taught you out of it.
Indeed, they did.
That's an amazing story.
Indeed, I was kind of shocked myself. I majored in nutritional biochemistry in college at MIT with some very heavy hitters. And, I thought that nutrition was kind of important and kind of interesting. I had an interest in pediatrics, and I knew about pediatric nutrition even in college. And then I went to medical school, and they told me none of it was of any consequence. And of course, there was no nutrition curriculum, despite the fact that one of the most important nutritionists in the world at the time, who wrote the textbook on nutrition, Maurice Shields, Goodhart and Shields was the book, was at Memorial Sloan Kettering, just a block away, was a Cornell professor. There was no nutrition curriculum. And so I would bring up questions about amino acids or fatty acids and what have you in class, and people would look at me like I had three heads, and they'd say, that this is not important. This is it's only about calories. And so I got no love, from this, no love whatsoever from this.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, okay, medicine doesn't need it.
Okay, so that's what they were teaching. Oh, medicine doesn't need this. Until I read your book, until I read Metabolical, I thought there was hope. But now that I know the business grounding of medical schools, and my daughter's an MD, she's an MD MBA. So, she and I kind of watched that, exactly your experience. She came up and said, Mom, there was just 3 hours of nutrition training, and it wasn't like 3 semester hours. It was like 9 to 12 on a Saturday morning.
Yeah.
And it was so confusing. Nobody really understood what the lecturer was talking about.
Yeah. Well, the data show only 28% of medical schools even have a nutrition curriculum at all. And those that do, the average number of contact hours are 19.6 hours for the entire medical school experience.
Yes.
4 years of medical school, 2,000 hours, that's 8,000 hours of contact, and 19.6 of them are nutrition. Nutrition ends up, accounting for 75% of all chronic disease.
Yes, yes.
And you spend 0.0001% on it. And of course, you don't even learn how to use it in order to be able to actually fix nutritional or chronic metabolic disease.
Well, I was confused about that. I thought maybe they just hadn't caught up until I read your book, until I read Metabolical, and you tell the story. It's one of hundreds of stories in the book that were just really eye-opening to me. I've been in the field for 25 years, eye-opening to me. So if you wouldn't mind telling the story of how medical schools came into being, the whole Rockefeller pharmaceutical connection.
Sure. So this all has to do with a document that was composed in 1910 called the Flexner Report. Now, the Flexner Report is perhaps the most seminal document in all of medical education. And it was composed by a gentleman by the name of Abraham Flexner, who he himself was not an MD. He was an educator. His brother was Simon Flexner, who was the first president of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York City. Now, the Flexner boys were joined at the hip. In fact, Abraham had actually paid for Simon to go to medical school because Simon was originally a pharmacist in Louisville, Kentucky. And Abraham paid his way through medical school, ended up getting an MD PhD, ended up working in pathology at the University of Pennsylvania. Actually, first he was at Johns Hopkins with William Osler, and then he got the job as chief pathologist at the University of Pennsylvania. And from there, he ended up being recruited by John D. Rockefeller himself to be the first president of the Rockefeller University for Medical Research under William Osler's, with his recommendation. All right, so that's pretty cool. That's a great story, and good for him with a good Jewish boy from Louisville, Kentucky. That's a good story, to be sure. Now, Abraham was an educator. He had written a book called The New College of Criticism back in 1908. Because he thought that we needed to have education in this country more like the German system.
Oh, right.
The German hierarchical system. And he thought it needed to be much more based in research. And he thought that science was not being taught properly. Right. Which probably was true.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, so that evoked, shall we say, he got some gravitas out of that. At the same time, John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, that one, he had a whole bunch of this byproduct of oil refining called coal tar.
Coal tar.
Coal tar. He didn't know what to do with it.
Right.
He had heard that coal tar was really of use in certain medical conditions, such as eczema and psoriasis.
Okay.
Put it on the lesions, and the lesions would get better. And in fact, coal tar is one of the top 10 medicines of the 20th century.
Really?
Yes, it has been.
No idea.
And it's available virtually everywhere in the world, and it's cheap.
So
and
it's for skin problems.
It's primarily for skin problems. The problem, of course, is it also causes cancer. But, back then they didn't know that. Small detail. But at the time, Rockefeller was kind of interested in sort of, building a second industry.
Right.
Pharmaceutical industry. He'd already built the petroleum industry, and now he was going to build the pharmaceutical industry. Yes. But there was a big problem. Problem was that the doctors didn't know how to use drugs.
Yeah.
Okay, because it was all like folk cures or Eye of Newton, would have towed or whatever. And,
Yes.
and there was no organized pharmacology or pharmaceutical sciences line of investigation or education within
Right.
medical schools.
Right.
And so he and Andrew Carnegie actually commissioned this report, and it turned out Simon, who was close to Rockefeller, endorsed his brother Abraham to write the report since he knew something about education.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so Abraham Flexner wrote this thing over the next 2 years from 1908 to 1910 called the Flexner Report. And in the Flexner Report, he basically said that there was a lot of junk being taught in medical school. And indeed, that is true. I mean, here's an example of something that was taught in medical school at the time. Okay, this is called phrenology. By feeling the bumps on your head,
yes,
determines stuff. And there was more stuff like that, and hydrotherapy and what have you, reflexology, and stuff that ended up becoming very alternative. But at the time was being taught in medical schools, but had no basis, had no evidence base behind it.
Okay.
And so the Flexner Report basically did away with all of that stuff. They got rid of like 47 different lines of education in the Flexner Report. And one of the things they got rid of was nutrition.
Oh gosh. Okay.
So nutrition was not part of the medical experience. Now, this was 1910.
Yeah.
In 1912, 2 years later, the first vitamin was isolated, thiamine, in Germany. And then there was this, basically the floodgates opened, and then after thiamine B1, then there was riboflavin B2 and niacin B3, and basically the teens and the 20s were the era of vitamins, and vitamins being basically nutrition. You could add this to food and solve disease, and they did. But that didn't become part of medicine.
Oh, gosh, the confluence of those two events. We're cutting that out of medical education in the US, and here's this incredible invention. I have to say that from a business perspective, when I read that story in your book, I thought to myself, aha, Rockefeller created a marketing machine for his coal tar. Indeed. And other pharmaceuticals.
That's right.
But this is very, I have to say that when I read that, Rob, my heart just broke for every doctor out there. Because your heart ought to break for every patient out there. Well, but I think there's two sides to this. I think this is really maybe because I have a daughter who's a doctor. She's also an MBA, and frankly, she enjoys the MBA side of her job much more than the practice. She says, Mom, I see somebody every 8 minutes. I may never see them again. I don't have a relationship with them. I'm not helping them. So I just thought, what were our hopes as a family when she applied for medical school? She was accepted to, the 11th ranked medical school, I'm not going to name it, in the country. We were just like, her future is assured. But the months went by and there was you can imagine growing up in my household, she knew food cures. She saw it before her very eyes. When she was 11 years old, I started getting the processed foods out of the house. Mood improved, allergies went away, fatigue, cravings, bloating, weight gain, infection, a constant sinus infection, all that stuff went away. She saw that before her very eyes. And I just have to think that she thought she was going to be able to work those kind of miracles, but you can't work those kind of miracles in an 8-minute office visit. This is a deeply rooted addiction that requires immersion in a caring expert community.
Hate to tell you, but you can't work those miracles in a processed food supply, no matter how many minutes you give to it.
Yeah. So
that's the base, is the food supply, because that's the only reason that we're even on the planet, is because there's food. But the question is, when the food becomes poison, then it's not food anymore. And so people actually rag on me. They give me a hard time. What do you mean, processed food's not food? It's food. It's not processed food. It's the adjective is processed, but it's food. And
opium is not a poppy.
Well, that's kind of
it's a drug. Yeah. But the brain's not reacting to these quote unquote foods like they were food. They're reacting to them like they're an addictive drug. But what I want to do, I want to finish this great point that we're making here, which is, nobody told my daughter or any of us as she embarked on this 10-year, I figured out it cost her $750,000 from front to back, lost income to get that MD, all through residency before she really started making a real income. Nobody ever said along the way, oh, by the way, this is really a setup for marketing pharmaceuticals, not really getting a medical education. Do you think that's a fair gripe?
It's a very fair gripe, because after all, who underwrites medical education? Big Pharma.
This is shocking. Go ahead.
That's where the money comes from. Nobody can pay the amount of money in tuition that it would cost to keep a medical school running. So where does the rest of it come from? It comes from, underwriting from other places like Big Pharma. So they have a say in what ends up being taught. And so there's been a very specific, shall we say, active cognitive omission of anything having to do with preventative medicine.
Yes.
You cannot get the word prevention into medical school. That's not the way it works. And I will tell you, when I wrote Metabolical, I actually was going to write a book about preventative medicine. And I submitted it to my publisher, my previous publisher. This book was published by HarperCollins. The previous publisher was Penguin Random House. And I submitted it, and I basically, laid out the case for prevention from a medical standpoint and from an economic standpoint, et cetera, and as a prospectus. And they said, we can't take this book. And I said, why not? And they said, we've done our market research. There is not one book ever written in the history of mankind about prevention that has actually sold. Not one, not even Andy Weil's, books, nothing. He's got a zillion bestsellers, and the one book he wrote on prevention tanked. So we're not going to go there. So I ended up writing Metabolical in a slightly different way, and ended up getting having a different publisher ultimately.
Yeah. And then you go back to the business background. Who is paying for media? It's not, people who want to have Americans not spend money. It's people who want them to spend money on processed foods and pharmaceuticals. So you don't get the media coverage for prevention.
Absolutely. And I will tell you that Metabolical, has not gotten nearly the attention of the big media companies, in part because, they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them.
Exactly. So, they're not gonna cut off their income. But before we leave this topic, I also want to draw. So this is why I wrote you and I said, I want to talk about the plight of the doctors. And it is because I am now I'm just kind of like furious and sad, because I certainly didn't, enthusiastically support my daughter to go to medical school so that she could end up representing a pharmaceutical company. I feel like we were hoodwinked. I feel like we were led astray.
Well, here's the problem. There's this thing online called health grades. Okay. And today, if you actually tell patients what they're supposed to do, you get a lousy review on health grades. because that's
go in. I know, Rob, because you have personal experience with that. Rob is a pediatric endocrinologist, and you went out into the world being a doctor with all this education, but that nutrition undergraduate degree in your background and what happened.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So there you go. Now we have some questions from the audience, so let's try to answer them. So one question is, do other countries struggle with disease the way we do, especially as it relates to our lifestyle? And the answer is absolutely yes. Yeah. Now, some countries actually struggle worse. And let me give you an example. India and China. So India and China today have an 11% diabetes prevalence, and they are not fat. Conversely, we are the fattest nation on earth, and we only have a 9.4% diabetes prevalence. So if obesity is the cause of diabetes, how come they have more diabetes than we do? And it turns out because obesity is not the cause of diabetes. Obesity is a marker for the metabolic process that leads to diabetes, in the same way that hypertension is, in the same way that heart disease is. They all travel together, no argument. And the reason is because all of these diseases actually ultimately have the same metabolic substrate problem called the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the little energy burning factories inside your cells.
The cells.
Every single cell in your body has them, because every cell in your body needs chemical energy in order to be able to function. And that energy is called ATP. So no mitochondria, no ATP. No ATP, no life, right?
Cell stops functioning.
Wrong. Turns out there are cells that don't have mitochondria. They ferment. They undergo glycolysis. They don't burn all the way to completion. And those cells are called cancer cells. They're also called fetal cells. They don't have the mitochondria because they need their carbon backbones for structural components. They're not burning all the way to carbon dioxide. So there are actually two ways cells grow. But the bottom line is you need ATP. You can get it from glycolysis or you can get it from mitochondria. If your cell is supposed to be burning, then you need mitochondria that are fully functional and efficient and, at full capacity. Well, what if you were consuming something, or what if there was something in the water or in the air that were affecting your mitochondria negatively? What if they were actually poisoning your mitochondria? Would you be able to be alive? Would you be able to be healthy? Would you be able to be functional? Would your brain be able to actually finish a sentence? This is what's going on today. We have mitochondrial dysfunction, and we have them in different parts of our body. If we have it in our brain, we have brain fog, which ultimately can end up as Alzheimer's. We can have liver mitochondrial problems, in which case we end up with fatty liver disease. We can have heart mitochondrial disease, in which case we end up with heart failure. We can have kidney mitochondrial disease, in which case we end up with chronic renal failure. Okay, in other words, different mitochondria in different parts of the body will lead to different diseases when they are poisoned. Well, it turns out the poison that everyone is exposed to, that the whole world is exposed to, is sugar. Sugar is a mitochondrial poison. Now that sounds really, really stupid.
No, it doesn't to me.
But it's not. And people say, oh no, sugar is just about calories. No. Nope, it's not. And we've got the data to show that the calories have nothing to do with it. The reason sugar is dangerous is because it inhibits one competitively, one non-competitively, two enzymes in the mitochondria. First one is the one that causes mitochondrial biogenesis, AMP kinase. So AMP kinase is the enzyme that basically is the fuel gauge of the cell. Okay?
Rob,
it'd be like pouring sand in your petrol.
When I read your book, one of the stunning chapters, I cannot recommend this enough. You just line out, you just list them out, the 8 ways in which processed foods kill cells or prevent cells from
Indeed.
from functioning. I mean, my dad was a biochemist, and I know the first time I started to show him the lists of things that were getting better in people that were getting off the processed foods, he said, "Oh, Joni, you cannot ever show that list to anybody. This just looks like snake oil. You'll lose credibility immediately." But I've had the same experience that you're talking about, Rob, over these 25 years. You take people off of processed foods because you actually address the addiction. And the range of things that get better is just incredible. I mean, would you agree that when people come off processed foods, it's kind of fun because you have a long list of things that get better. Have you experienced that?
I have seen patients who basically tell me the brain fog is gone.
Brain fog.
Feel better. The problem, of course, and Joan, you know this is better than anybody since you wrote the textbook on it. Addiction takes time to fix.
Yeah.
Okay. And the reason it takes time to fix is because you've downregulated all those dopamine receptors in the reward center, and they don't come back immediately.
But they do come back eventually.
If the cells aren't dead.
If they're in a good community, yes. Right. You can't revive a dead cell.
You can't revive a dead cell, not in the brain. And so if those cells are just, if the dopamine receptors are just downregulated, then they can come back, but they need 3 weeks to come back.
3 weeks. Yeah, but that's nothing.
It is something. No, it's something. It's something. If you are addicted to sugar and you don't know you're addicted to sugar.
Yes.
Someone tells you you need to go on a sugar detox and you try. Okay, you're going to start feeling those symptoms within 24 to 48 hours, and you don't
run right into withdrawal.
And you don't understand why.
You about withdrawal. If you're not in a protected community, the pain. I mean, you could get a headache. I mean, we know what to do about those headaches, but you'll feel crazy and you'll go right back to the sugars. Got to be in a community.
The point is that when people are heroin addicted, they know why. When people are cocaine addicted, they know why. When people are nicotine addicted, they know why.
Yes.
When people are alcohol addicted, they know why.
Yes.
But when they are sugar addicted, they don't know why.
And they go to their doctor, and the doctor wants to help them so much. And the doctor has no training in sugar addiction. We know sugar is more addictive. We have evidence that sugar is more addictive than cocaine and more destructive than cocaine. And it's very rare to find a medical professional of any kind who can identify that. But I want to go back. We missed this.
Maybe we should just put the cocaine back in the food.
You know, one of the quotes that I use of yours all the time is, "We were healthier when we were smoking."
Yeah, well.
I use that quote all the time. It's true.
Well, we didn't have chronic disease. We had cancer, but we didn't have other chronic diseases.
141 diseases associated with processed foods.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. So I just want to swing back to this. Doctors didn't ask to be put into this position. They didn't ask to be threatened, if they do start looking for sugar addiction and they to have their ratings decrease because they're doing something outside the box. They didn't ask for this. I mean, doctors are retiring early. They're frustrated. They're sad. They're depressed themselves because they're not fulfilling the vision that they were given in medical school. And I think you do an incredible job in the book of describing the parallel with the dietitians. They are also a marketing arm for an industry, and people don't know that.
Yeah, well, but the dietitians, I take them to task pretty severely in the book, and the reason is because they're doing math, not science. Now, math is easy. Math is easy. Science is hard. That's what it comes to. This notion that a calorie is a calorie. The notion that foods convey calories, and therefore different foods, because they convey different levels of calories, that's what determines whether they're bad or not. That's how saturated fat got its, bad name, was because of the Atwater equation, because fat was 9 calories per gram and carbohydrate was 4 calories per gram. So therefore fat was more energy. So therefore fat made you fat. That's, just math. And it's, not even just math, it's an empiric mistake is what it is, because it has no
when you first said that
reality. But that's where we got from. Saturated fat makes you fat because, they found fat in the arteries. And so it had to come from saturated fat. And, all of this is hogwash. All of this is complete BS.
Yeah.
And the thing is, we bought it. We bought it hook, line, and sinker for 50 years. It became dogma.
Because that was the messaging that was delivered to us. Yeah.
Right. And we didn't know anything.
And it has, this is another thing I got out of the book. Guys, if you're listening to this, I have been in this field for 25 and a half years, and I learned things from Metabolical I didn't know. And this is another one, which is the origins. It used to be the American Dietetic Association. Now it's the Academy of Nutrition and Dietitians. But the origins of that was also in business. It was for the purpose of marketing a processed food product. I don't know if you would, I don't want to give everything away in the book. I just want to,
I'll just tell
eye openers.
Yeah, I'll just tell people real quick. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics was originally the American Dietetic Association. It was set up in 1917, and there were two co-founders. One of the co-founders was actually a real dietitian. The other co-founder was someone who had not even graduated high school. She was an apprentice to none other than Dr. John Harvey Kellogg.
This is shocking.
And her name was Lena Cooper, and she learned all of her dietetics from John Harvey Kellogg. Now, John Harvey Kellogg is a very interesting gentleman. There was a movie that was made about him that it was actually quite good, but it didn't do very well at the box office. 1994, The Road to Wellville, with Anthony Hopkins playing John Harvey Kellogg. I recommend it to everyone. It's worthwhile. It's pretty severe. And John Harvey Kellogg had two bugaboos. He had two, bees in his bonnet, and he had two bugs up his ass. And they were, constipation, that was up his ass. And the other one was masturbation.
Okay. Oh, yes.
Constipation and masturbation. And he was on a quest to cure constipation and masturbation. And he was under the impression, for reasons that are still completely unclear to me, that the reason for constipation and masturbation was protein.
Oh, yeah.
And protein meant meat. And meat was bad. Now, in John Harvey Kellogg's defense, the meatpacking industry had lots of problems. And we know that because Upton Sinclair in 1906 wrote his famous expose, the first food expose, The Jungle, which was about the meatpacking industry and all the things that went into the meat. And that was actually the origin, that book was the origins of the beginning of the FDA. Okay, after The Jungle. So, Kellogg might have been right about the meatpacking industry, but he wasn't necessarily right about meat and protein and constipation and masturbation. That's a different story. The point was, he wanted people on a low protein diet, and certainly a zero meat diet, because he was a Seventh-day Adventist. Right. In fact, he actually had, when he was a teenager, had actually typeset the entire works of the founder of the Seventh-day Adventists, Ellen G. White, and he was absolutely completely taken with it. In fact, Ellen G. White financed his going to medical school.
His education,
He went to medical school at a good medical school. He went to NYU. This was back in the 1860s, I think 1868.
I have a couple of dietitians in my recovery community, and they are just, they're upset, of course, but they are having to throw out their entire dietetic education as we educate them about the addictive properties of processed foods. 40% of dietitians work for the processed food industry. They are trained to promote processed foods. Kellogg had a business, and it was great that it coincided with his religious beliefs and his nutritional beliefs, and he could create this. It's a sales arm. It's a marketing arm for the processed food industry.
Indeed, it is.
But this is another instance of, so many people have said, I'm going to go study dietetics and I'm going to get my food under control, or I'm going to study to be a nutritionist because I've got to get my food under control. They spend 2 years, they spend tens of thousands of dollars, right. Or I'm going to learn how to be a health coach and get my food under control. None of it works. You just like, I'm going to be a therapist so that I can fix my depression. But all of those conditions, as you're writing about them, are stemming from this cell dysfunction, which you describe incredibly beautifully. And it all goes away when you get the addiction under control.
Right. That ultimately, when you stop the addiction, then you realize you need to eat real food, and then all of a sudden your diseases go away. They are inexorably linked. Let's answer some of the questions from the audience here. So I want to take this one right here. Saturated fat doesn't clog arteries. That's right. It does not. It does not clog arteries. Okay. Saturated fat does raise your LDL. I don't argue that. LDL goes up in response to dietary fat consumption. But it turns out there are two LDLs, not one, two. The first one's called large buoyant. The second one's called small dense. They are not the same. You measure them together on your LDL, on your chem profile. So doctors don't know that there are two because they only measure one, and it's the conglomeration of the two, but they're actually two, large buoyant, small dense. Turns out large buoyant is what goes up with dietary fat. Large buoyant is not the cause of heart disease. Small dense goes up with carbohydrate. And it is the cause of the heart disease because it is dense. It basically doesn't float, it sinks. And so it comes out of laminar flow within the arterioles. And also it's small enough to get under the surface of the endothelial cells to start the foam cell formation process, which then leads to cardiovascular plaques. So saturated fat is not the cause of heart disease. Carbohydrate, triglyceride, actually has a much greater relationship to heart disease. The hazard risk ratio of LDL to heart disease is 1.3. The hazard risk ratio of triglyceride to heart disease is 1.8. So 50% more contribution from triglyceride, which is from sugar, than LDL, which is from saturated fat. So that's...
You've done the research on how high fructose corn syrup converts to fat.
That's right. So basically, when your liver is overwhelmed, your mitochondria can't handle the load, the liver has no choice but to take the excess and turn it into fat. That is a process called de novo lipogenesis, DNL, new fat making. Yeah. So on this subject of LDL, someone just asked, how do you measure the two forms? Well, there is an expensive way that's not covered by insurance. And then there's an easy way to get an index. So the expensive way is called a VAP analysis. It costs about $500 and only about 2 or 3 labs in the country do it. One of them is Atherotech here down in the peninsula. It will give you the small dense and the large buoyant LDL. And that's great, but again, insurance doesn't cover it. And so, you got to fork up $500 and your doctor has to know how to interpret the results, which they probably don't. The second way is much easier because you get it on your standard lipoprotein profile when you do, just your lipid tests. The LDL means nothing without the triglyceride. It's the pattern of the two together that determine whether or not you have large buoyant or small dense. If you have high LDL and low triglyceride, you have large buoyant. If you have high LDL and high triglyceride, what you have is metabolic syndrome, you have insulin resistance, and therefore you have small dense. So you cannot look at any of these numbers in the lipid profile in isolation. You have to look at all of them together. And the last thing in the world you should do is just read across where it says high and low, next to it. That is the single worst thing you can do. But of course, that's what your doctor's doing, because that's fast. So another, you have to know what's going on.
For somebody who's been diagnosed with heart disease, how does getting the processed foods out help? What is the reversal process?
So if you get the processed food out, you're getting the refined carbohydrate and sugar out, because that's what they put into processed food. They put the sugar in and they take the fiber out. That is the hallmark of ultra processed food: high sugar, low fiber. And basically what that means is that your liver is not going to be pelted with all of this carbohydrate. And therefore it's not going to turn all that carbohydrate into triglyceride. And so you back out of it. So you cannot fix this with medicine. The only thing you can do is reduce the substrate, which means change the diet.
You use two brand new words that I love. Some diseases are druggable and some diseases are foodable. So would you say heart disease is a foodable disease and not a druggable disease?
Right. Chronic metabolic disease is mitochondrial disease. And we have not yet found a medicine that can get to the mitochondria. But food does.
Yeah, but food does.
But food does. That's why all these diseases are foodable, not druggable.
We just had a question about IBS.
Yep.
Go through the same thing you just did about heart disease, but IBS. Why does IBS respond? Why is it a foodable disease and not a druggable disease?
So IBS can be from a couple of different things, but one of the things that we think IBS is from denuding the intestinal epithelial cells. So your entire intestinal epithelial cell lining of your gut has mucin, a polysaccharide, lining the entire thing as a barrier to keep the intestinal contents in the intestine and to keep the intestinal epithelial cells safe and away from those bacteria. The problem is those bacteria in the intestine that are in the intestinal contents, in the chyme, in the what will become the feces, they got to eat something. The question is, what do they eat? Well, they eat what you eat. The question is, how much did you get versus how much did they get? The thing they love the most is fiber. They eat the fiber. Okay, you don't eat the fiber; they eat the fiber. Okay, that's why bacteria eat dead trees. And you get rot. On trees is because the bacteria love the fiber. Well, that's going on in your intestine. The point is that if you've taken the fiber out of your food, you have deprived those bacteria of its nutrients, of what it needs to grow and to be happy. And so if you don't feed your bacteria will feed on you. It has been shown that the bacteria will actually strip the mucin layer off, use that polysaccharide because it's like fiber, and will use it instead. And so now you have a denuded intestinal epithelial milieu. And that means that the bacteria are smack dab right on top of the intestinal cells. And therefore you can get leaky gut, you can get bloating, you can get IBS, you can get inflammatory bowel disease, you can get systemic inflammation because of things that cross like lipopolysaccharides or cytokines or even whole bacteria for that matter. And that then sets you up. That systemic inflammation sets you up for chronic metabolic disease.
And that's reversible. You take the processed foods out, you put real food with real fiber. We just got a question. There's a huge difference between real food with real fiber and sugar. So the fructose in an apple is not the problem. It's when it's extracted and concentrated, it becomes addictive. You eat enough of it through the mechanism of the addiction to cause things like the loss of the lining in your intestines that Rob's describing.
Right.
There you go. There's one of those, I want to just jump in there and just say the explanation that Rob gave for how heart disease is reversed, how irritable bowel syndrome is reversed, you can go through and describe that mechanism for 100 diseases. So that's a good distinction. Sugar is a drug, more addictive than cocaine, more destructive, and apple is food. Wolfram just put up another question, is getting a coaching degree worthwhile? All of these degrees, nobody is teaching how to recover from a severe addiction to processed foods. So we have a training. We have a training in processed food addiction, which I would recommend for any professional. We all have a lay path. So even if you're not a medical professional, you can get training to help yourself and your loved ones at processedfoodaddiction.com. So Wolfram, thanks for putting that in.
So the bottom line is, for health coaching, it depends on who's coaching you. What we've learned is that not everybody believes the same things. There's a lot of junk out there, and I wrote Metabolical there's 1,054 references.
Yes.
Well, they're not in the book, by the way. They're not in the hardcover version, because it would take up 70 pages, and it would have grown the book by 70 pages, plus killed a lot of trees, plus the book would have been $5 more. So we elected to take the 1,054 references and put them on its own website. So you can go to metabolical.com and you can find all the references for the book based on page number in the book. Point is, everything is referenced directly to the primary literature.
Yes.
And that's on purpose, because I want this book to be a textbook for medical school.
It should be.
Look, HarperCollins said you got to write this book for the general public because that's how we make money. But I actually wrote this book for doctors.
Good, yes. Any medical professional should read that book. And then, so that's actually, I've talked about this in our recovery community, the addiction reset community, for weeks now, Rob. I've talked about it ever since I started reading it. But one of the things, you have gone and you've gotten an additional degree outside the medical degree, your medical degree in law. So talk for a few minutes, if you don't mind, about how do we create a coalition? Who would be in a coalition to start to fight you're outing the truth about processed foods and about I think the medical professionals who are unwittingly, unknowingly, helping to promote them. So where do we go with this?
Well, look, here's how it works. Okay. There's no medicine for this. There's no pill for this. And to be honest with you, based on the fact that this is a mitochondrial problem, there will likely never be a pill for this. There's only food. And the problem is there's food and then there's poison. Okay. Yes. Food is food and processed food is poison. Okay. Yes. You can't even call it food. Cheetos is not food. And if you believe that Cheetos is food, then you are sunk. You will never, ever, ever.
You'll die. You'll die terrible death.
We are trying to train the next generation of physicians to understand how this works. We have set up a private foundation called the Robert H. Lustig Research Foundation to try to do just this. The point is, though, that you have to have the public on board. So public education is essential, but public education is not enough. But you have to start with that, because that's the only thing that
drives demand.
It's the only thing that gets people going. So here's how the people in the audience need to think about this. All right. This is a long-term process. This is not, you don't just snap your fingers and have it all go away.
Yeah.
There have been four cultural tectonic shifts in America in the last 30 years. And here they are. 4. 1, bicycle helmets and seatbelts. 2, smoking in public places. 3, drunk driving. 4, condoms in bathrooms. Now, 30 years ago, if a legislator had stood up in a state house or parliament or Congress or anywhere else and had proposed any legislation for any one of those 4, they had gotten laughed right out of town. Mm-hmm. Nanny state, liberty interest, get out of my kitchen, get out of my bathroom, get out of my car. Okay? Today, they're all facts of life.
Mm-hmm.
You don't see anybody protesting any of those.
Yep.
And if you pull out of your driveway and you haven't clicked your seatbelt, your kids will scream at you.
Yes. Used to be the other way around.
Right. Now, how did that happen?
Yeah.
How'd that happen? 30 years ago, you'd have gotten thrown out of the state house. And today, you get thrown out of your car by your kids. How'd that happen? Answer, we taught the children.
Mm-hmm.
The children grew up and they voted. And the naysayers are dead.
Yeah.
This is a generational shift. All of the cultural tectonic shifts are generational shifts. It turns out you don't actually change the naysayers' minds.
You just wait till they pass on.
They just die. That's right.
I like your thinking. I mean, this is a sad thing, but the most vociferous proponents of processed foods are dying from the processed foods.
Indeed.
But it's hundreds of millions. This is, I mean, the number, 67% of food consumed in the United States is processed foods.
As a physician, I am absolutely disheartened by that.
Mm-hmm.
As a citizen, I'm going, why can't we speed up the process?
All right. I didn't know about your foundation. Do you mind talking about your foundation?
We are trying to do the research. We're trying to bring the research to the policy, and we are trying to educate physicians in order to be able to carry this work on after I'm gone.
Yeah. So just go into the details if you don't mind. Like,
just go
I know
on.
you're funding research, but how are you bringing that to the policymakers? You're in San Francisco. I know San Francisco is fighting this, the sugar tax. So I have an undergraduate degree in economics and political science. I have a master's in business. This is where I think the rubber hits the road. This is, we saw the only thing that worked for tobacco was going to the courts. Now the courts are more conservative. Where is this going to happen? So
the question is, you got to bring the food industry on board. Okay, the food industry are the enemy.
It's like, but Rob, come on. That's like saying, okay, so to stem the opium addiction epidemic, you got to bring the drug dealers on board. Well, they are the drug dealers.
Well, you sort of do. Let me explain how. Okay, ultimately, the food industry has told me they don't care what they sell, as long as they sell. Now, right now, it is cheaper for them and more profitable for them.
And more addictive.
Processed food. Yeah, absolutely.
And more addictive.
No argument. It's the reason their annual profit margin went from 1% to 5%, in the years of high fructose corn syrup. Understood. Agreed. The point is that they would sell whatever you provided them to sell, as long as they made just as much money or more.
So they've
changed the food business model.
When 67% of what they're selling is drugs.
Right.
Then you can't, I don't see a pathway to taking away 67% of their business. Americans are eating almost twice the number of calories they need to eat. You're going to take away at least half of their business, replace it with low margin items.
Well, you have to make those.
They can't market.
So you can't, no. So that's the point, Joan, is you have to make those high margin items. You have to turn the food system procurement and marketing model on its head. Now,
and can Americans afford to buy those clean food at that price? They
could if it were done properly. So we are actually working with the World Economic Forum and with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Right now, we have a white paper that has been submitted and is being reviewed for this next WEF right now to do just this. These are the big guys on board in an attempt to try to bring the science to a rational policy. Ultimately, there are many stakeholders at this table. Okay, the patients, the doctors, the hospitals, the nutritionists, the dietitians, the food procurement and distributions, the supermarkets, the food industry itself, the farmers, the growers, the pesticide people, the fertilizer people. There are a lot of people involved
profiting. There are a lot of people profiting from this.
And they have to continue to profit. The question is, how do you build that food business model so that the food industry makes money doing the right thing instead of the wrong thing? How do you get them to basically profit from helping people instead of poisoning them? And the answer is, it can be done. It can be done. But everyone has to be at the table, and everyone has to.
And you have to look at the whole basket. You have to look at how much you're saving on medical and all of that.
That's right.
But the thing I say to people that you can do today, even if the politicians are dependent on the processed food industry for campaign contributions, you can do something today which you can stop spending your money on these horrible substances.
You vote 21 times a week.
Yes, I love that idea.
The point is that the food industry will not make it if you're not consuming it. So
exactly.
You do have power. The problem is you have to not be addicted.
Yeah.
And that's where you come in.
We're working on it. We are working on it. We just opened up the website, processedfoodaddiction.com. We offer a lot of different services and training. You will find something there. There's a place to sign up for the free information right at the top of the page. Do learn. What does it mean to have an addiction? What does it mean to have been given an addiction? We got an addiction from the same business model that gave us tobacco addiction, nicotine addiction. Those tobacco folks came over to processed foods in the 1980s and
they
brought their horrible model with them.
Listen, we have to wrap this up. It is now 10 o'clock, and you guys, it's 9 o'clock, sorry. You guys have been wonderful.
Amazing.
We so appreciate the questions. The audience, between the two of us, we have apparently 60,000 followers, and presumably some of them are on this Facebook Live with us. And we want to thank you for all of your support. Look, we are all in this together. I cannot do this alone. Joan cannot do this alone. We need you. You are our foot soldiers. We are one community. Let's help get the message out. Let's help fix the problem.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.